This is fun because I don't say I don't know any of you. I just met some people that knew me 35 years ago in Masset on the Queen Charlotte Islands. I didn't think anybody would remember, but there you go. But I don't know this diocese. So anything I say about parishes, it's not because I'm picking on you. Of course, you may discover that picking on other parishes is actually picking on you as well, because we've got common issues right across the church. But sometimes there's a feeling that we're different. Well, in many ways, of course, you may well be, but I don't know you. And so we'll see what happens. And after hearing the Archbishop's introduction, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. You know, it's tough to be told, be inspiring. Yeah, right. Tell me, do you know what this season is? I know it's the end of moose season, but apart from that, I know that's why you're here, because you've given up on getting your moose this year. But you know what's happening around now? You should, because if you look carefully, you'll see that not only moose, but Anglicans have a hunted look. Because probably tomorrow or the next Sunday, someone's going to stand up and say, it's stewardship time. And Anglican eyes glaze over. Because it doesn't matter what they say, we know they're after our money. And then, toward the end of October, we relax, because it's all over for another year. Now, obviously, not in this diocese, but every other diocese in Canada, and any others that I've been to, there's that sense that it doesn't matter what you say, that's what it's about. Well, I've discovered that really isn't what it's all about. And until we step back and say, what is it really? No, don't wait for someone to tell you what it's about. What is it really all about? And the more I've wrestled with what is essentially stewardship, I discover that I can't separate what is essential to the Christian faith and what is essential to evangelism and what is essential to the life of the body of Christ, and what is essential to a healthy parish. I find that it's all the same. And it really is stewardship. So that's why I want to spend pretty well all today unwrapping this idea of what stewardship really is, no matter what you've been told, no matter what you'll be told tomorrow or the next Sunday. I'm sure the clergy in this diocese won't be saying things like that, but if you were to go next door, that's what they'd be saying. We've got to challenge that. I'm going to ask you some questions. There are no right answers, so that's fairly safe. There's no pass mark. I guess I was supposed to tell you something about myself before we get going. You may suspect that I could have been English at one point. I've been in Canada 56 years, and I'm thinking of staying. I've spent all my ministry, except a couple of years, in BC, starting way up in the north on the Yukon border, and gradually moving south with the seagull. No. And I found myself eventually Archbishop of British Columbia and Yukon, living in Vancouver as Bishop of New Westminster. Then when I retired, that was the 2 years I took out, and Denise and I went to Tanzania. We wanted to get away from the diocese, so we went 7,000 miles. It was effective, because by the time I came back, I'd forgotten that I'd been bishop of that diocese, and I could sit around and criticize. Oh no, I mustn't say that. But that's the story of my life. I just sort of stayed in BC, did some parish work, became Bishop of Caledonia, then Bishop of New Westminster. But along the way, I started to discover, someone asked me to give a talk on stewardship. And I think John Robertson was there. It was in Richmond in BC. And I'd never done it before. And I mumbled my way through a presentation and realized I hadn't wrestled with this subject. I'd just taken it for granted that everybody knew what stewardship was, and so I didn't do anything. And it was at that point that I started to say, I've got to see what this is about. So I'm going to ask you, what does, in your particular parish, not the one next door or somewhere else, but the place where you worship, what are the main responses to the idea of stewardship? Anybody, just shout out if you've got a response of some kind. What's the sort of, when you begin to talk about stewardship, what's the first sort of reaction? Sorry? Resistance. Resistance, money, anything else? Enthusiasm? Excitement?
Can we talk about something else?
You mean today? Oh. You're right. That's a typical response. Sorry? Here we go again. Yes. Yes. Someone over here. I did. Okay. What? Do you actually hear that in your parish? Yeah. That's an unusual response.
All we talk about is money.
All we talk about is money. It's often true. Buildings. Yeah. These are the typical responses. And why? I mean, how can you blame people when, in fact, our focus is at a certain point in the year? Why that time in the year? What's happening in the church around that time of the year? I don't mean it's Thanksgiving. What's happening around that time? I can't hear that word. Harvest. Well, that's a thought. I'd not thought of that. Year's end. What happens at year's end? Thank you. Anything else? Budget. There's another. The D word. What's deficit? Debt. Diocesan apportionment. I mean, we're all familiar with this. Nobody said anything that surprised. Well, I guess I was surprised that in one parish they're talking about what are our gifts. More would say we've given all we can. Here's another question. What did Jesus say about stewardship? Yes, thank you. I must preach on that one. Thank you. Leave everything behind. John Robertson will be delighted to hear that one. It's called planned giving. Because the fact is we're going to leave everything behind. I remember asking a group of people once, I said, do you remember the famous Howard Hughes? The multi-millionaire. Do you know how much money he left? And everything. Everything. So, yeah, we'll leave it all behind. What did Jesus say about stewardship? Yes. Let me tell you a story. I didn't make it up. It's in the book. It's in... Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You can search through it and find it. I can't remember. But in that story, Jesus talks about a situation that all the people listening would know about. He said, once upon a time, there was a man who had some servants. The word he used actually was slaves, but we don't like that word, so we called it servants, but they were in fact slaves. And all the people around him knew what he was talking about because all the wealthy people had slaves. And the slave depended on the master for food and clothing and housing and, in fact, life. The master had total ownership. And he said this man had slaves, servants. And he called them together and he said to them, I'm going to hand over my goods, and I expect you to do something about them. And he picked this one and he said, here's your share of what I own. And the next one, here's your share. It's not as much as his, but that's what I'm giving you. And this fellow over here, this is your share. It's not as much as those, but there you go. Now, off you go. And they went. And eventually he summoned them and said, come back and tell me what you've been doing. And one came back and said, I worked hard, I did what I could, and I doubled what you gave me, and here it is. And the master said, that's great. That's exactly what I expected of you. Now you can come and celebrate with me. Second one comes along and said, well, it's true, you didn't give me as much as you gave him, but I did what I could with what I had, and I did well, and here it is, I doubled it. And the master says, that's what I expected you to do. And well done. Why don't you come and celebrate with me and him? Third one came along feeling very perky because he said, you know, I have done extremely well. I have preserved everything you gave me. I didn't lose a nickel. I knew you'd be hard on me if I didn't do well, so I did well. I protected your interests. And the master said, you're useless. And there's no place for you in my household. And the poor little bloke said, what did I do? He said, that's the problem, you did nothing. That's a powerful stewardship story, because underlying it, what's Jesus saying? What's Jesus saying in that underlying the story? You see, you get behind the stories. Jesus wasn't just entertaining people. As they thought about this, what would come to mind? Yeah. Trust, yeah. The master trusted those servants, all of them. Faithfulness, yeah. My ears are getting old, along with the rest of me. You'll have to...
Christ calls us to work with the gifts that he's given us, and he wants us to go and use what he has given us and spread out.
Yeah. Interestingly, I avoid using the word gift and given, because that suggests somehow I own these things. If I give you a gift, you own it. God hasn't given anything. That's a shock, isn't it? Don't put that in the headlines of the newspaper, because, oh, it doesn't matter. I live 4,000 miles away, so who cares? God has only entrusted God's goods. The master doesn't abdicate ownership. He doesn't say it's all yours now. He says it's all mine. But I'm trusting you. And for whose benefit? For my benefit, says the master. That's essentially what stewardship's all about. The bottom line, underlying everything we believe, not just what we do about our money, but everything we believe, the bottom line is it all belongs to God already. Everything. Our lives, our energies, our financial resources, everything already belongs to God. The business of the servant who is trusted, and the word steward means a trusted slave. That's what the idea of the word steward means, a trusted slave. We are trusted for the benefit of the one who trusts us. And everything we have, and everything we are, already belongs, and it's put into our hands for the benefit of the one who trusts us. I told the people, the clergy the other day, a favourite story of mine, because it so startled me that I've never forgotten it, and whenever I tell the story that I've just told, I have to tell this one. Because I was in a church a good deal longer than this church, and I often thought they weren't paying their light bills because it was so dingy, gloomy at the back, I could barely see, and that's where all the Anglicans were. One fellow came forward and I discovered he was a Pentecostal, but in that church, I don't care whether you believe this or not, but it happened. I was sitting in my magnificent throne. It was a little folding chair that they had in there. And during the service, someone came up to read a scripture. The lectern was there. And she was completely blind. And she walked up the aisle, led by her seeing-eye dog. And she stopped, or the dog stopped, I guess, and she stopped. Sorry, I'm out of focus. Oh dear, I'm always out of focus. And she bowed. And the dog bowed. Anyway, that's another story. This same church, I was in the middle of a spellbinding sermon, and a voice from the gloom at the back. Can I ask a question? Well, I don't know whether you do that during sermons. I've not had that happen very often. I've had someone swear at me in the middle of a sermon, but they weren't asking a question, they had their answer. And I said yes. I was scared because I hate questions and I don't already know the answer. And he said, do you know the story of the fourth servant? And I thought, I'm sure it's not in the Bible, but so I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, there was a fourth servant. And this fourth servant got his share, and off he went. And he went on a ship, and everything he touched was a success. He couldn't fail. Everywhere he went, he just succeeded and succeeded until he had amassed an enormous fortune. And came the day when the master sent a message, time to come home and report. He was so delighted because he knew how pleased the master would be because he'd done so well. He could imagine all kinds of rewards and all kinds of excitement when he got home. And he got it all onto a ship. And they headed for home, and just before they got to the coast, there was a terrible storm, and the ship went down, and everything was lost. Nothing left, and the poor man crawled ashore with just his wet shirt, pants, I hope. And he went to the master and said, I am a total failure. I had a great fortune to bring home, and I've lost everything. I've got nothing to show for what you gave me. And the master said, well done. And he said, but I failed. But the master said, you did what you could. And the young man sat down. You see, we tend to think that success is what really counts. God says, I call you to be faithful. Of course, you hope there'll be success, but success and failure are not the issues. Faithfulness is the issue. It is required, says St. Paul. It's required. It's not an option. It is required of a steward that one be found faithful. That's the condition Not, it is required that a steward be successful. And we need to grasp that taking risks and failing is more like stewardship than doing nothing and neither failing nor succeeding, just doing nothing. And that to me is the foundation of stewardship. Now I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know how you're going to discuss this with one another. Some of you will have to turn around, and that might be uncomfortable in church. It's interesting to see so many of you packed together, because I was taught that in the Anglican church you have to go like this, and if you can touch anybody, you're too close. So it's good to see. Don't try that, you'll poke somebody's eye out. But if you can, just talk to one other person, or two if they're close enough. I want you to think about this question in relation to your own parish where you work, not what the diocese does and not what the national office does and not what we do in British Columbia, but what happens in the parish where you worship. And this is the question I want you to spend a few minutes with. What do you believe God has entrusted to your particular faith community? What has God entrusted to you? Think about that for a few minutes. Bishop of Calgary was in church in Calgary, so he told me some years ago, this is a long time ago, and he got to the pulpit, said, "The Lord be with you," knowing that should bring a response, and nothing happened. So he tapped the microphone. He didn't think it hurt him. So he said, "There's something wrong with this stupid thing." And everybody said, "And also with you." What has God entrusted to your faith community? Let's not get too pious about it. Ordinary, everyday thing. What has God entrusted to you, to your faith community? Not what you wish had been entrusted, but what is actually there. Any suggestions? Just shout out as loud as you can. Oh, that ruins it, doesn't it? Okay, we can all go home. Let's narrow it down a bit. Yes? Church family. Yes? Sorry? Children. Not in our church. Anyway, yeah, children, yeah. Thank you. To solve that problem. And so, I think it was at a synod, we asked people at the synod, no, it must have been in some other context, but we asked people not just to say how much money they were likely to give next year, but how much time they were willing to give and what skills they brought. And we collected a lot of data. And it was at a synod later the next year, I think, when some people said, "What's the point of doing that and doing nothing about the data you got that talked about time and skills? And you did everything about what we said about money." So we have to be careful that when we talk about time, talents, and treasure, we're not in fact really in the back of our heads thinking treasure. Okay,
Which one is listed last, though?
I can't hear.
That phrase, which one is always listed last?
Yeah. Well, it always is, isn't it? The last shall be first. That's why we give it priority. You see, when you, and I suspect if you ask in your congregation, here's an exercise for you. This is some homework. Gather a little group of people at the coffee hour tomorrow. and ask them, what do they think God has entrusted to that parish? See what they say. Because the more we dig into that question, we start to realize that many things are put into our hands. We often play them down. In the parish where I worship, when I'm not wandering around, we have a very nice parish hall, which, in my opinion, God has entrusted to us for God's purposes. We use it for a coffee hour, but now somebody gave a gift and we revarnished the floor, so we're not allowed to use it because we'll scratch it. And you think, it's been entrusted to us for what purpose? Well, apparently for God's purposes, but none of God's people in the church or outside of it are allowed to use it. Eventually, just in the last couple of weeks, the rector said, this is nonsense. We're going to do what we were doing before, which was feeding hungry people with a meal in the... Yes, they'll scratch the floor, but that's what floors are there for. And we just didn't need to tart it up so much. Oh no, I don't use that term. But we didn't need to make it so beautiful that it's like our front room back home. We never used because it was the front room. Never went into it. That's where all the good furniture was. Anything else that God has entrusted? Get the people that you worship with. There must be 2 or 3 that you could stand around and talk about things like this. During the coffee hour, say, what do you think? Yesterday at this conference we were at, that was a question we were asked. What do you think? What has God entrusted? Because that raises the next question that I want you to struggle with a bit. Barry, sorry?
Can I turn to that question? I have to admit, I've been to many churches.
Yep.
The ship is sinking.
Yeah, every congregation has a background, a past. Certainly, the priest who moves in and assumes that it's starting all over again is mistaken. But we're going to look at that later. This idea of survival, putting it back the way it used to be, is an issue that we're going to talk about. Thank you for raising that. The question I want you to answer, having looked at what has God entrusted, in the light of the kind of things you heard and said, again restricting it to your parish now and not what used to be or you wish could be in the future, now, what is your congregation doing with what is entrusted? Okay, what are you doing? What are the people doing? Not should be doing or wish they were doing, but what are the people doing with what is entrusted? Just have a few minutes chatting to the same people, if you don't mind speaking to them again. Will you tell me, you've told me some of the things that God has entrusted to your faith community. Now tell us some of the things that you're doing with what God has entrusted. It's very difficult not to start to say what we ought to be doing, or even what we wish we were doing, or even what the next parish is not doing. But try and focus on your own particular faith community. What is happening? What is being done with what God has entrusted to you? Any comment? You really do have to shout, because churches are not famous for...
We have a youth ministry.
Youth ministry. Yep.
We have a team of people who are going to start going into schools and preparing lunches for kids that don't get lunch before they leave the house in the morning. And that's, all the denominations are getting in on that.
Wow.
And volunteering a day a week.
That's allowed in this province,
Pretty much.
obviously.
Yeah.
You're not going in as illegal immigrants.
Oh, no, we were asked to.
Yep. You see, it's forbidden in BC. That's my point. Yeah. Unless you're First Nations. And then I'm allowed to go into a First Nations school because that's federal. Whereas provincial says no religion in BC, I can tell you.
But these programs don't necessarily promote religion, they provide an opportunity for kids to come to, be fed because they're not getting a healthy breakfast or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's ministry, but it's...
Of course it is.
But it's not preaching out,
It is.
in a sense.
It's saying, this is what God wants us to do.
Yes, in an unspoken...
Yeah, exactly. Don't you see we've got to start enlarging this unfortunate phrase that we use, preaching the gospel, when we often mean from up there. That's probably the last place people hear the gospel. No, I mustn't say that. I don't mean this church or that pulpit, but that's not the only place it happens. And what you're talking about, you mustn't ever say, oh, that's not preaching the gospel. It's essentially preaching the
What I
gospel.
mean is that they don't feel threatened by it.
Exactly. Exactly. Good. Thank you. Anything else? What are you doing with it? That God's...
Good people come together about a year ago to start working on welcoming activities that will make the church more welcome to everyone. And that's probably one of the more community building things that's happened.
Yeah. The church I go to, we have greeters. They're inside the church, and
It's like Walmart.
yeah, it is. Yeah, they search your bags. No, they. And they welcome. I go to church. They welcome me. They say, "We're glad to see you. Are you sure you brought your envelope this morning?" Oh, that's great. St. James, Vancouver. That's downtown. They used to do that. And then the rector said, you're welcoming the people who are already inside. What about all the people that are just drifting by? So now the greeters, they're required to stand completely outside the church, saying to people as they pass, we'd love to welcome you in here if you care to come in. I mean, and it's part of downtown Vancouver, the East End, that's pretty rugged. It's interesting the number of people that probably never been inside a church come in and have a snooze and then a coffee out. I mean, but the point I'm making is that the welcoming is not for those who are going to come anyway, so much as for people who might never have occurred to them to go to church. Anything else? What are you doing with what God has entrusted?
We run a community kitchen.
Community kitchen.
And feed and have clothing, etc.
And you're feeding people who need to be fed.
Also, we started a new program going outside in our area around the church and going to the community and dropping off an invitation, knocking on the door and saying,
Yep.
we have this youth program going on,
Yeah,
etc., just to let people know.
yeah,
who you are.
yeah. We had an outreach program at the church I go to because we found homeless people were making their sort of temporary tent-like homes in the bushes around the church. So our outreach project was to suggest we cut down the bushes. That'll teach them. God has entrusted this church to us. We're not going to let it be polluted by hungry, homeless people. However, it's pretty sad, isn't it? Pretty sad. Anything else? Yes.
My church has an informal service on Sundays, coffee house style, for folk who would not feel comfortable in a formal setting, in a pew,
Yep.
and with a set liturgy.
Yep.
And it's been...
That's it. It's all interesting because we're starting to see that the work of the church is not just like, this setting. That in fact, things have been entrusted to us that force us to look beyond ourselves to other people. Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder if you talk among yourselves in your congregations about these things. Talking to one another, as well as asking that little cluster tomorrow morning about what God had entrusted, begin to help people talk about what are we doing about it, because the chances are other people will say, well, maybe there's other things that we ought to be doing with what God has entrusted. Maybe we should be doing other things. It's interesting how once a congregation catches on to the idea that it's not all theirs, we don't own anything. We don't own the building. I don't know who owns it legally, but it's not ours. It's only entrusted to us. And for whose benefit? Remember the story? What was handed over to the servants was entrusted for whose benefit? The owner, the master. It's all entrusted to us for God's benefit. Tell me, here's another couple of minutes to spend together. I hope you haven't stopped talking to one another. It's going to be a very quiet session. But what does God get out of it? That's a crude way of putting it. What is God's benefit? In what way is God benefited by what we do? Don't tell me theologically God doesn't benefit. I know that's true. I've read that book.